Hi everybody, my name is Jimmy.
And I'm Kat.
And welcome to Dinosaurs Will Always Be Awesome. Today we're going to take a look at those amazing walking tanks, the Ankylosaurs. With the help of our special guest from the Royal Tyrrell Museum, Dr. Caleb Brown. It's going to be awesome.
Oh my god. Are you seeing this right now? It's an ankylosaur. You don't know what an ankylosaur is? Well, I'm surprised. Because Ankylosaurus is one of the world's best known species of dinosaur. With its armor plating and the iconic tail club, this dinosaur has been featured in artworks and historical paintings, and it was part of the 1964 New York World Fair. This big belly-fused lizard is a favorite among kids and adults, and in spite of its familiarity, little is really known about the species due to a lack of material.
That lack of material wasn't for a lack of trying. In fact, when the term dinosaur was first coined, one of the first three animals was an ankylosaur called Paleosaurus, whose name means woodland lizard. Now, even though it was discovered in England way back in 1832, we've only found a few fossils, including part of the skull, some vertebrae, and the distinctive armored plates and some neck spikes. Early paleontologists had to work with what we knew of modern animals to fill in the picture, sometimes with wild results. This replica, by Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, has stood on display at London's Crystal Palace since 1842. And while it looks more like an iguana or a monitor lizard than these armored animals that we know now. When Barnum Brown described the first Ankylosaurus in 1908, he reconstructed it in the same way, based on animals that we already know. He figured that the Ankylosaurus would have a body like a stegosaurus, combined with the scutes of a prehistoric armadillo called Glyptodon, which, as you can see, are two totally different animals. The most current science of Hylaeosaurus is that it's a basal dinosaur, meaning it's further back in the family tree. They had yet to evolve some of the robust features of the Ankylosaurs, like the long head horns of a Scolosaurus, or the mighty tail club of Ankylosaurus itself, or even the densely packed armor plates of Borealopelta. Now, for a little more on that awesome tail club, let's go back to Kat.
In 2017, the Canadian paleontologists Victoria Arbour and Jason Milan redescribed the genus to reflect newer ankylosaur discoveries. Turns out that even though Ankylosaur is an iconic dinosaur, the best known member of its group, it was bizarre compared to its other relatives. It had been assumed that the unusual tail club of ankylosaurid dinosaurs was used actively as a weapon, but the biological feasibility of this statement had yet to be examined. Ankylosaurid tail clubs are composed of interlocking vertebrae, which form the handle. The large lacrimal osteoderms form the knob. Larger knobs could generate sufficient force to break bone during impacts, but average and small knobs could not. Tail swinging behavior is feasible in ankylosaurids, but it remains unknown whether the tail was used for intraspecific defense, interspecific combat, or both. New discoveries of the armored dinosaurs continue to shape our understanding of these incredible walking tanks, perhaps with no greater example than the one we're going to be speaking about next, with Dr. Caleb Brown of the Royal Tyrrell Museum.
Everything we do on this show comes down to one vitally important question. So, Caleb Brown, what's your favorite dinosaur?
Oh, good question. I think my favorite dinosaur would have to be Styracosaurus. So Styracosaurus is one of the ceratopsians. It's got the big horn on the nose, but it has all the spikes going straight off the frill. And I've always had a soft spot for it.
It's
all
a
about
beautiful
them
animal.
spikes.
Yes, that's probably my favorite ceratopsian as well. That and Cosmoceratops, because he's got the most horns. So if you're going to go the most horns, I'll lean towards that. But Styracosaurus, definitely a really cool choice.
Cosmoceratops is like the jealous neighbor who lives next door to a Styracosaurus and says, "Well, I'm not going to stop at just 9. I'm going to keep going." Keeping up with the cosmos is what that would be called. That was a TV show.
Exactly.
Why Styracosaurus though? What caused that to become the favorite out of all the dinosaurs you've worked with?
Yeah, a couple of things. So Styracosaurus is regionally unique to southern Alberta, which is nice. It's a local dinosaur. It's, I guess, elaborate in its display. One of the things that really interests me as a researcher is these cranial ornamentations that you see across dinosaurs. So like the crests of hadrosaurs and the frills and horns of ceratopsians. And Styracosaurus is a classic example of that.
Absolutely.
But one thing about Styracosaurus is that the style of or the structure of its skull, the ornamentations and the horns around the outside of the epoccipitals, that's changed since its initial discovery, right? Didn't John Hatcher's original version have two coming out almost parallel and then in different directions, and we've kind of adjusted that over time, haven't we?
Yeah, it's changed a bit, especially in the last 20 years, and that's because we've found a lot more specimens of it. We found both bone beds, which preserve a good detail for both variation and growth, which is nice to get for dinosaurs, and we just have more specimens. So the holotype specimen of Styracosaurus, although it's beautiful, it either has some pathology or some distortion going on with the frill. So that's kind of been evened out. And we have a better idea of how variable these things are now that we found several more specimens. So.
Yeah, hopefully we can find more specimens of the local BC dinosaur, Fairysaurus, because right now there isn't very much information about what that little guy looked like. We've actually spoken before. Back when Borealopelta was first unveiled at the Tyrrell Museum, I was working at a radio station called CFAX 1070.
So here we go. Dinosaur Facts!
With Catherine Abbott.
Asked if you wanted to come on the radio in Victoria, and you spoke to me on the radio way back then about this guy. So
it was a bit of a whirlwind. We had lots of media attention.
I've also talked to Victoria Arbor.
Mm-hmm.
And she's our, I believe that you two know each other because you've probably studied the same dinosaurs.
So when I was doing my master's at the University of Calgary, she was doing her master's at the University of Alberta. So there was often kind of socializing between the two groups at the universities. And then we bypassed each other several times during our career, where we ended up at the place the other person just was, but we just barely didn't overlap. So we go back quite a ways.
Yeah, she's a really inspiring person because for women in science and women in paleo, she's just such a bright, shining light for following your passions and following your dreams. And I just absolutely love her research about ankylosaur tails and nodosaur tails and how she kind of figured out if they were actually used as a weapon or not. That's something that I've always found really interesting about her research.
Yeah, she's a great advocate for science, and even more so for women in science. So.
All right, you want to start talking about nodosaurs and Borealopelta?
Absolutely. I think it'd be a great. I have a couple of questions I want to get out of the way. So Borealopelta is a gorgeous specimen, and it's one that we've learned a lot about. And where is this in relation to the ankylosaurs on the dinosaur family tree?
Yeah, so when people say ankylosaurs, they could mean a couple of different things. They could mean the group Ankylosauria, which includes both Ankylosauridae, a family, and Nodosauridae, which is where our Nodosaur Borealopelta fits. Or they could mean Ankylosauridae as a family. So so people can call it a Nodosaur, people can call it an Ankylosaur. There's a bit of vagary when you don't use the exact ending. So ankylosaurs are armored dinosaurs in general. And they have these two groups. There's Ankylosaurus, which are known for having the tail club, and there's the Nodosaurs, which are known for more having the shoulder spines and not having a tail club. The early origin of that division is not well known. Some of the more early branching taxa, we're not really sure if they are Ankylosaurs, they're Nodosaurs, or they're outside that branching event. So there's research going on to figure out exactly when and where that happened and what the first members of each of those groups look like. But those two groups existed for much of the Cretaceous and up until the end, where the dinosaur extinction occurred.
And Nodosaurs and Ankylosaurs are thyreophorans, correct?
Yeah,
Yes.
so they're in the larger group called Thyreophora, which includes things like Stegosaurus, the big plate.
I was just about to say. Yeah. So Stegosauruses were kind of the precursors and are in the same family as Ankylosaurs and Nodosaurs, and that's kind of where they come from.
Mm-hmm. They're the same basic body plan. They're quadrupedal. They have armor in the form of either these plates or covered in kind of flatter osteoderms. They're herbivorous. They have fairly simple teeth. All of these, they share all these kind of similar features.
Yeah. So Borealopelta has a very unique discovery story because it was found somewhere completely unexpected. Could you describe how it ended up where it did?
Yeah. So first off, I need to back up a little bit more and put it in some context. So Alberta in Canada has an amazing fossil record, especially for the Cretaceous. And there's a huge amount of research that goes on every year, paleontologists going on finding new discoveries. But in addition to that, because there's so much Cretaceous bedrock, specimens are being eroded out naturally, and they're being found by members of the public. They could be walking their dog, they could be fishing, they're finding stuff all the time. And we often get public reports of fossils. And in addition to that, when there's industry in the province, especially when they're digging up Cretaceous bedrock, so whether it's building a road for a new subdivision or sewer system or pipelines, if they're digging through rock that has a good chance of having fossils in it, there's a permitting process where paleontologists look at the plans for the project and see if they need to be evaluated for potential or if they need to be monitored. So there's a chance for us to kind of protect fossil resources at that end. And even if that doesn't happen, if they hit something important, one of the requirements is that they need to report it to the museum. And that's because the fossils in Alberta are considered cultural resources or historical resources. They're owned by the province. So if you're digging a driveway or you're building a new road and you hit a dinosaur, you need to stop. We'll send a team right away, evaluate it, and collect it. So in that context, there was a mining company working up in northern Alberta, north of Fort McMurray, Suncor, one of the big oil sands companies there. And they're digging up a resource that's called oil sand. It has basically a mixture of bitumen and oil. To get down to it, they need to remove the formation called the Clearwater Formation. And while they do this, they have a good chance, because they're moving millions of cubic meters of rock, of hitting fossils. And they have found and reported significant fossils before, mainly marine reptiles, because this is marine rock. It was at the bottom of a shallow seaway. In March of 2011, the operator of a large excavator, his name is Sean Funk, he was digging into the hillside, and he noticed, both based on the hardness of the rock and the color and the texture, that something changed, something different happened. And he saw this kind of polka dot-like structure emerging from the rock. And what those were in hindsight were the osteoderms. Those are those bony plates that make up the armor of the animal. So he knew it was something different. He reported to his supervisor. They went through the proper channels and reported to the museum. We had some initial photographs of the specimen. We didn't know exactly what it was, so a team was sent up. Now I need to clarify that at this point, I wasn't working for the museum. I wasn't involved in the actual discovery or the collection. I was brought in much later. So the team arrived at the work site. They got all the safety training and all the requirements and whatnot. And then they went about evaluating the find. And pretty quickly they figured out that this wasn't a marine reptile that had been found before. This was something different. Because of the osteoderms, it was one of these armored dinosaurs. And because of the age of the rocks and where it comes from geographically, we knew that this was both an animal that was represented a time that we didn't have a sample from before, and was from a geographic place that we didn't have a sample from before. So there was a good chance it was going to be a really important discovery. And there was also telltale samples right off the bat that there was more than just the bones preserved, that we had some of the soft tissues preserved, which was really exciting.
Well, from my understanding, kind of a cute thing about the story is the guy who found it, he had been visiting the Tyrrell Museum a little bit before he had noticed there was something in the rock, and because he had dinosaurs on the brain and he noticed something weird in his scoop, he actually was like, maybe I should stop and maybe that could be important. So I think that that's kind of a neat little segue into the story as well.
Mm-hmm. And it really highlights the fact that museums act as places of outreach for the public, educating them about the science, and you never know when that opportunity will have payoffs down the road.
Absolutely. And another really kind of devastating thing about the story was when they isolated the dinosaur into the rock and they tried to pick the dinosaur up, it actually broke the dinosaur in half, and then they had to try and... I remember watching the video and seeing the faces of the poor paleontologists like, oh my God, that's one of the worst things that could ever happen in a dig, is the entire chunk that you've just spent days and weeks isolating just breaks apart.
Yeah, it was one of those heartbreaking things that happens, and you're just like, oh. So there is a fairly characterized method for collecting these things. Often an industry finds you need to be a bit more creative because the scale of these things is humongous. In this case, the methods that were used, they deviated from the regular situation, and it didn't work, and that's obvious in the movie. There is a silver lining to that, though, in that our technician Mark Mitchell, who prepared the specimen, he worked on it for I think 5.5 years. He's very dedicated. He was able to put it back together, so it was kind of the Humpty Dumpty thing. He put all the pieces back together, and because of where it broke, we were actually able to learn more about the animal. It's not something you would wish upon the specimen, but we were able to learn more from that. We had some internal kind of sections through the animal, and we were able to learn about the stomach contents, which might not have been as obvious if the animal had been collected intact. So I'm trying to put a positive spin on the silver lining on the crumbling.
This is one of those
specimen.
stories, though, that when we would look at it from different lenses in the fields of paleontology, because there's so many different types of paleontologists who would study this. So to the general public, you hear they were digging a dinosaur and it broke in half, and everyone's like, you have the academics and the research scientists who see it, like, and then you get the prep scientists who are like, all right, we're going to need more glue. And then it's like, okay, well, it's Thursday already. All right, here we go. A lot of other discoveries have come as a result of these kinds of accidental breakages. I know the B-Rex specimen, also known as Catherine, was in the field during its discovery and had to be broken in half to get that thing out of the field where it was. And that was what led to some of the early discoveries of possibly preserved soft tissue and the preserved blood and the introduction of medullary bone to help us determine the male and female tyrannosaurs based on this. So don't break it if you can help it. But sometimes good things happen. Sometimes there's a mystery.
But if you do break it, make sure you look at the broken parts.
Take a bunch of pictures.
There's another example on the same line of a turtle. I think it's from the Royal Ontario Museum that was broken at some point during transport or being put on display, and it revealed eggs inside the turtle. And it was like, oh, didn't know that those were there. So sometimes these things can have a positive
little happy accident.
A dinosaur resembling a 2,800-pound pineapple ended up dead in a river. How on earth did this particular dinosaur get into this river?
So the the animal was buried in a shallow seaway, and it obviously didn't live there. It was not buried where it lived, so it would have lived probably on the coast. And at some point, it got transported out to sea and got buried in the sediment at the bottom of the sea. We don't know if that happened while the animal was alive, if it got transported out and drowned, or if it was already dead at that point and got picked up in a swollen river and transported out. We don't really know the timeline of that. We know a lot of other things about the dinosaur, but we don't know that exact timeline. And then it probably went through a process called bloat and float, which is something we see today, where a decomposing animal builds up gases inside the animal and it tends to kind of bloat out and float and gets carried around in the currents. And then at some point, it explodes or leaks or something, and it sinks to the bottom and can be rapidly buried. And if it is rapidly buried in the right circumstances and stays buried long enough and is exposed at just the right time for someone to see it, then we can learn about it as a fossil.
And that's called a concretion, correct? When it's buried quickly with a whole bunch of protective rock around it. Yeah, there's a chemical process that happens where biological material, it could be a skeleton, it could be bits of plants, they tend to act as nucleus, and the concretion forms around this, and it forms this very hard resistant rock. And that was the case with Borealopelta. The rock around it was fairly soft, and then you get this big block of really, really hard, basically concrete, and then the animal is sealed inside. Which made it really difficult for Mark Mitchell to work on, which why it took him 5 years? Yeah, about 5 years. I think he would describe it as, I think he has described it as, the rock is basically concrete, and the fossil itself, although it's beautifully preserved, it's not hard or resistant. He would describe it as basically like talcum powder. So you're chipping away very carefully, you're removing this really hard substance down to the surface, and then that surface is very soft. So it took him, about 7,000 hours, 5.5 years, to work on that. And Mark loves Ankylosaurs, and this is the best Ankylosaur in the world, so I don't think he would let anybody else touch it, so he was quite happy to do it. But it takes a lot of commitment to prepare that. And I want to highlight again that I'm talking to you today, but there was a whole team of people who collected the specimen in the field. Mark spent a huge amount of time preparing it, and there was a whole team of researchers who collaborated on the research as well. So I'm just one of the many people involved in this discovery. Absolutely, is usually the case with most dinosaurs. We just usually see the one person who's the face of the dinosaur, but there's lab technicians, and there's researchers, and there's the people who actually spent the time in the field digging the animal out of the rock, and sometimes we don't talk about them. So it's really wonderful, and what an honor to have a dinosaur, especially your favorite dinosaur, named after you. That's just so special. We thought it was appropriate, and he spent so much time with that specimen. He spent more time with the specimen than anybody else, and often that's the case with the technicians. They spend more time with the specimens than anybody else. And we thought it was an apt namesake for the specimen. We had decided on it as the authors, and at some point we were kind of committed to it, and we had to go and officially let him know and technically ask for his permission, although we're pretty sure he was fine with it. And I remember Mark's a pretty level, even-keeled guy, and I think he was pretty excited that this was going to have his name on it. So I think I would cry if there was a dinosaur named after me. I think that would probably that'd be the top of your life. There'd be no point in going on after that.
What was Plan B? Yeah. Like if you came up to him and said, "Hey, Mark, we wanted to name this Borealopelta Mark Mitchelli," and he looked at it and said, "Absolutely not. No." What do you say? Okay, we're going to call it now instead. We got to find some name for how many times you could have killed something. Yeah, I mean, there's several options. You can, often the names are descriptive names. They're kind of anatomical. They describe the shape of the animal or what makes it unique. They can describe where the animal's from. So in this case, Borealopelta is northern shield. So pelta is often the case for armored dinosaurs.
we wanted to go with something shorter like Borealopelta, but that's actually already taken by another animal, so we had to actually add the extra syllable in there, make it a little bit harder to pronounce. The boreal part honors both the fact that it's so far north, even back in the Cretaceous, further north, in fact, but also that it came from the boreal forest. It doesn't come from the Badlands in terms of the modern ecosystem there. So it's kind of a double play on words there. There was a lot of different naming options, and myself and Donald Henderson, who was one of the other leaders of the project, he actually was involved in the collection of the specimen, and it was largely his idea for the Borealopelta name. It's a compromise. You both have things that you think are important, and you kind of meet in the middle.
And you typically don't find dinosaurs that lived in the forest because they don't preserve as well as dinosaurs that live in marshy lands that allow them to be covered up quickly. So it is very interesting to have a forest animal be discovered. And I think that's probably one of the only ways it could have been, was being floated out into the ocean and then buried into a concretion.
Yeah, the boreal forest name that refers to the modern environment that it was in. Although if we do reconstruct its environment back in the Cretaceous, we do get something that's somewhat similar. We get a conifer-dominated forest, lots of ferns. It would have been more coastal. It probably wouldn't have been very flat. It probably wouldn't have been as densely treed and nowhere near as seasonal. But we can put a little bit of kind of understanding of what that environment was based on the plants.
Yeah, speaking of plants and ferns, you said that you got a look into the stomach contents. Now, has any new research come about since the last documentary you were in about what that animal was eating, and how do you know what it was eating?
So when you look at the animal, there are broken parts in its kind of abdominal region. You can see this kind of, it's like a squashed sphere. It's about soccer ball sized. And all the other rock is pretty gray and featureless, and then there's this blob of light gray matrix that has these large kind of ping pong ball to marble size to grape size spheroids that are red and yellow and orange, and then inside that there's all this black stuff as well. So we knew it was something distinct. It wasn't just the normal sediment, and it was really restricted to where it was in the anatomy. So we had an idea just based on that it was stomach contents. When we took those samples and we embed them in an epoxy, slice them very thin, polish them down, look at them under a microscope, you see beautifully preserved plant material. And I mean, you can see the cellular detail on these plants. And they're all kind of chopped up and ripped up as if it's basically, if you took a Cretaceous forest and put it in a blender, this is kind of what you see under those slides. And we knew once we saw those first slides that we had something amazing, but myself and Donald, we're not paleobotanists. I can tell that they're plants, but beyond that, I can't do much with them. So we collaborated with a group of paleobotanists, Dave Greenwood and his team from Brandon, and Jim Bassinger and his team from Saskatchewan. And they were able to both determine the types of plants that these fragments came from, but also the tissues, were they the leaves, were they the stems and whatnot, and look at some relative abundance and relative proportion data. Wow. So really exciting data on diet.
Wow. That's pretty amazing that they were able to tell that you could look at it and you were looking at a Cretaceous forest. And they were kind of picky eaters, from my understanding. They liked particular types of plants.
Yeah, so most of what we find in there is leaves from ferns. And it's not from all the ferns that were living, it's only from certain types of ferns that were living. There were certain ferns that we know were there because we have pollen from them, or we have the spores preserved, but we don't see them in the stomach. We have a very small amount of tissue from cycads and very small amount from conifers. We knew both of these were abundant on the landscape, again, from the pollen data, but also from some paleobotany studies of that region. So with this, we can kind of have an idea of what was on the landscape that was kind of available to eat, and then what was in the stomach, and we can figure out what the animal was able to eat. What did it actually eat? And some of those were probably not choices that it could make. If you're talking about a tall conifer, this thing wasn't going to climb the trees and eat the conifer leaves. So it could eat them when it was low to the ground, but there were some limitations that weren't the animal's choice. And then there were some that might have been the animal's choice. We can't account for things like seasonality or local abundance. But when you see kind of a pattern where certain things are really abundant in the stomach contents, but other things that are abundant are not represented, one of the results is that this animal might have been selecting actually what it was eating, which is not necessarily surprising.
So this goes back to something that I wanted to ask you about. So there's the general consensus that, we have such a significant portion of the fossil record that we haven't been able to identify yet because these particular dinosaurs didn't happen to die anywhere near water. And that's such a vital element of the fossilization process. The fact that this animal was subject to the bloat and float, and it's the first one of its kind, does that give us any variations? Are we able to see any differences between the ones that lived closer to water sources that we have more abundant specimens of compared to some of these that were more, are boreal, forest living?
So this particular specimen, it's a one-off. We have one specimen, and the nearest comparison is in geographic terms hundreds of kilometers away, and in temporal terms tens of millions of years away. So we can't really make any meaningful comparisons. If you want to ask those types of questions, southern Alberta in the late Cretaceous is a much better area to ask because we have really good fossil records, multiple specimens, and we have it over kind of a transect, either going north, south, or east, west in some cases. So we can actually look at some differences regionally. But our particular specimen, Borealopelta, it's a one-off, so you can't really learn much from it in that sense.
This dinosaur is incredible, especially for research. Something interesting about this dinosaur is we could actually get a glimpse into what color this dinosaur was. How are you able to tell what a dinosaur that died hundreds of thousands of years ago, how are you able to tell what color this dinosaur was?
Yeah, so again, myself and Donald, we're dinosaur paleontologists, but we're not. Our fields of study aren't on exceptional preservation, or at least we don't have a huge background on that and things like color. So when we were first looking at this animal, we wanted to collaborate with people who work on these kind of really exceptionally preserved things and are kind of moving the technology and the methods forward and asking interesting questions and really probing what we can know about these specimens. So we teamed up with Jakob Winther and his team out of University of Bristol. And one of the things that he's big at is paleo color. And if we were to be talking 15 years ago and we were talking about paleo color, my answer would have been, you make them whatever color you want because we don't know and we'll probably never know what color dinosaurs were. Things change. We have the most common way that color is determined for fossils is based on melanosomes. So these are little, they're basically pigment organelles in the cells, and their shape and their pattern kind of helps us to figure out at least a bit of a constraint on what colors were there. They don't tell us everything, but they tell us some hints about what pigments were there. And we hope to find some of these preserved in the skin because there was lots of organics there and whatnot. But we looked at the samples and there was no melanosomes preserved. One of the other ways that we can learn about this is actually through geochemistry. So we took those samples and we looked at what were the organic molecules that were preserved. And one of the things that was quite common was a molecule called benzothiazole, which is basically it's a breakdown product of pheomelanin, which is the reddish brown pigment. So people with red hair have an abundance of pheomelanin, whereas melanin or eumelanin is the black color. So we know that based on the signatures of the chemical breakdown products that pheomelanin must have been fairly common, as was eumelanin. So it was probably a brownish red color. We don't have a good sense for how that varied along the animal in terms of if it was striped or patterned or whatnot, but we have that basic understanding of what some of the pigments were. We can also look at how that density changes. Again, because we have those breaks, we can look at the back of the animal, the sides, and the belly. And we see that it's quite dense and common at the back of the animal, but it kind of disappears as you get to the sides and the front. And this is a pattern that's called countershading, and it's quite common in modern animals. It's kind of ubiquitous. Most animals have it to a certain extent. And if you think of a ball that's kind of pure white, and it's being lit, you would draw it by having it white on top and darker underneath, and that's because the light comes from above. The sun is kind of always above us, and our minds are kind of trained to pick out that as a three-dimensional object. So if you see, even on a computer screen, if you see it that's light on top, dark underneath, it's coming out at you because the sun is getting reflected off the top and it's getting shadowed underneath. So your mind immediately thinks about that shape. If the coloration of that object is the opposite, so it's dark on top, light underneath, that kind of counteracts that natural lighting phenomenon, and you get kind of a constant color. So it acts to hide the body outline. And this works quite effectively in marine situations, but also on land as well. And it works for both prey items trying to hide from predators, but also predators trying to hide from their prey, or at least sneak up on their prey. So finding out that it was countershaded was not necessarily a surprise, because it's quite common, but it's a big animal, and it's a really well-protected animal to have countershading, and that was one of the key findings of that study.
That's so incredibly fascinating that you were able to find all of that information from this specimen.
I'd like to ask you about two completely unrelated animals, if I may. I'd like to talk about turtles.
Go for it.
And armadillos. Now, turtles, with their strong and sturdy shells, their carapace and the back part, the plastron. Yeah,
the plastron is the front and the carapace is the back. Yeah.
Bones are fused together; they do not move when the animal is ambulating. An armadillo has these different scutes, these little protective outer coverings that are flexible and move to help them to roll into a ball for comic relief. For nodosaurs and ankylosaurs, more like a turtle or more like an armadillo?
More like a crocodile.
Oh, really?
So the turtles are weird. Turtles, their shells it's a composite. Their endoskeleton is hypertrophied, and they have also the dermal scales on their offset and fused. So, and their shoulders are inside their rib cage. They do all sorts of weird things. So they're not a good analog or comparison. Armadillos are closer. They have more flexible armor, but it completely covers the animal. The best analog for an ankylosaur is probably something like a crocodile. Crocodiles, they have osteoderms all along the body, especially on the back of the animal. But they also have scales that don't have bone in them. They have just normal scales that aren't osteoderms. And that's what we see with Borealopelta. Although the scales were continuous across the body, the osteoderms were not. There were kind of these bands, and between the bands there was flexible tissue. And that's similar to what we see in crocodilians. So that would be my comparison if I had to draw one.
So a more direct answer from the stuff that I said is they have flexibility. So they're not a solid mass. They can move and turn as the animal was moving around.
Yes, for sure. So when we look down the animal, we see on the neck it has these big osteoderms coming off. These things were solid. And then there was multiple rows of flexible scales between them. So it could move its head side to side. And even down the back of the animal, you see alternating rigid bands and flexible bands that probably would have aided in the flexibility of this animal. One of the cool things about this particular specimen is that it's not straight. The head is slightly tilted to the side, so you can actually see how it opens up on one side and closes up on the other. it gives it a bit of personality as well. But that just shows that how flexible some of these things actually were.
That is really cool. This is such an amazing specimen. Having seen it in person, you walk into the room, and the way that the Tyrrell Museum has set it up, it's incredible because it is the centerpiece into a dark room, and the missing pieces, they've actually hired an artist to fill in with this kind of metal tubing, and it really gives you a sense of the scale and the shape. But more importantly, it actually, you look at it and you feel it, and it's almost as if you can see it breathing. This is how well this animal has been preserved. And it was preserved as well because, like we were discussing earlier, was because of the concretion, right?
It was for several reasons. When it was buried, it must have been buried quite rapidly. If it wasn't buried rapidly, it would have decomposed more, and the skeleton would have been separated by the actions of currents and water. It probably wasn't scavenged. We don't see any bite marks. We don't see any shed teeth from scavengers, which we often see in some of these at least for marine reptile falls. There's a good chance it was buried in a fairly low oxygen environment as well. And that would help in the preservation. So there's probably a couple of really good reasons why it was so well preserved. The cool thing about where it comes from is, I mentioned it comes from this clear water formation, so it's a pretty thick unit of rock. There's one unit near the bottom of that. It's the DWABA member, and within that there's this, it's about 3 meters thick, I think, and it has lots of glauconite, so it's a greenish layer. That one layer is where we get most of our marine reptiles from, and where Borealopelta comes from. So they're not kind of randomly throughout the formation. There's this one interval where everything was just right for either currents or depth or oxygen conditions or whatnot for these to get preserved very well.
That's fascinating.
And the whole animal wasn't discovered. There are some pieces that are missing. Is that because the scoop kind of lost some of the animal?
We don't know. A good guess is that it probably was complete before it was found. And some of it, kind of the back half of it, would have been lost before it was realized there was something there. And, excuse me, it's obviously unfortunate. We would have preferred to have the whole thing. But I mean, I would take the front half of an exceptionally preserved, amazing dinosaur than nothing. And so, yeah, it's not the most complete dinosaur. We have some dinosaurs that are 100% complete. We have about the front half of it. But what we do have is unique from other dinosaurs in that it preserves both the soft tissue in place and the three-dimensionality of the dinosaur. So often we have animals that show exceptional preservation. They have skin and feathers and stuff, but they're often squashed flat. They're kind of like roadkill, and they still provide us a huge amount of detail and scientific information, but they lack the they lack the oomph. They lack the visuals of there's a whole 3D animal in front of me. And we do have some other dinosaur mummies, as we call them, with the skin preserved. And I think this is probably the best example of that, where you have both three-dimensionality and you have exceptional preservation. And you can kind of say that if you kind of squint your eyes a bit, it looks like it's just, it could just get up and walk away. It's quite amazing. It's the closest you'll ever get to being face-to-face with a dinosaur, at least until we find a better one. But I'm not holding my breath to find a better one.
I tend to agree with that.
I tend to agree with that. Yeah, it's incredible.
Right. Jimmy, do you have anything else?
Jimmy, do you have anything else you want?
So I want to go back to one other question regarding the physical anatomy and comparing all these different kinds of animals. So part of actually what prompted our Kat and I's initial conversation around this is that when you look at modern depictions of ankylosaurs in popular media, the two examples that spring to mind are in Jurassic Park or in Jurassic World, where they had them as walking around as the big tanks with the spikes around the outside. And then you look back at documentaries like Walking with Dinosaurs, where you have the same Ankylosaurus, but there are no osteoderm spikes around the outside. And looking throughout every version of media, like children's books, and many different papers, professional scientific models, even depicted in certain museums, some have decided either they do or they don't. Which one is right?
Our understanding of what these animals look like has changed quite a bit in the last decade, and that's due to a couple things. It's due to amazing specimens like Borealopelta. It's also due to a lot of hard work by various researchers. Victoria Arbour is probably the foremost for ankylosaur dinosaurs and researching what they look like. The reconstructions of these with these osteoderms in very specific bands and rows and patterns, I think those are accurate. That's what these animals would have looked like. You would have been able to see those osteoderms in life. Now, saying that, the osteoderm itself, the bony core, would not have been exposed. It would have been covered with a keratinous sheath, so a horn-like covering. And we actually see those preserved in Borealopelta. But the shape and the size of those roughly correlates. It does exaggerate the size of the osteoderm a little bit. That being said, if these animals are put in a situation where their life is at stake, they will use whatever resources they have available. And if they happen to have horns coming out of their head or their body, they will use those in a defensive way. So it's not necessarily one or the other. But in the context of what's driving the evolution of these structures, I tend to kind of favor the sexual selection hypothesis.
Probably similar in pachycephalosaurs. The bigger horns you had, the more attractive you were to the lady, and you got the lady friends. That makes a lot of sense.
So if it's not for fighting or for feeding, it's for looking good. Gotcha.
I like to contrast it as armor or amour.
Ooh.
Oh, that's good.
Fancy. That's the kind of thing you say with a pinky up.
Well, I've asked all of my Borealopelta questions, so Jimmy, if you have anything else, now would be...
So we've seen, as you mentioned just a moment ago, the science of paleontology is continually changing. Every new discovery leads to some further understanding of how these animals lived and what their role was in the environment. What kind of fun things are we looking forward to in the next few years? Like, what do you think some of the next few discoveries that we'll be working on? What are you working on now? What kind of projects are you going through right now, Caleb?
So in a general sense, we tend to not find things unless we're looking for them. And I think that's the case with soft tissues. The more we actually pay attention to these things, the more we look for these things, the more that we'll find. And that goes for a wide variety of dinosaurs, that as we have more people looking, as we have a more diverse group of people looking for these things, and as we are looking across the globe, we're going to find more of these soft tissues preserved and learn more about these animals. So it used to always be about the skeleton, and the soft tissue or the organics is all gone. And the more we learn about these things, the more we learn there's actually a lot more there that's preserved if you kind of have the right situations available to see it and to look and to make these discoveries. So I would say that's going to be the big field of kind of what's actually preserved there, both in a gross kind of morphological context, but also in a geochemical context.
So, for example, educating fossil preparators to know what to look for, because I know that there's a horrible case of Archaeopteryx getting its leg hair or leg feathers shaved off by their fossil preparator, and they didn't know until they looked at the pictures after and were like, oops. Well, if...
There are a few more details about the stomach contents that we didn't fully cover. There was a few surprises once we actually delved into what was preserved there. Two surprises about our knowledge. One surprise was that there was a fair amount of charcoal preserved in the stomach. And obviously no one was grilling back in the Cretaceous. This charcoal would have come from wildfires or forest fires on that landscape. And what it means is that area must have recently undergone a forest fire. And this animal was eating its leaves, and it was probably unintentionally eating in bits of charcoal. Now that's cool from an ecological perspective, because if you're an animal that likes to eat ferns and you're living in a landscape where it's dominated by large conifers, if a forest fire goes through, one of the first post-fire succession organisms that comes in is the ferns. They just sprout like crazy. And they have both a much bigger biomass than normal because everything's opened up. But that new growth is also easier to eat, and it has more nutrients than some of the old growth ferns. So in an ecological sense, it makes a lot of sense for this animal to be hanging out in an area that had been burned recently. And we see this pattern with large herbivores today. We see this in North America, in conifer-dominated forests. We see this in Africa as well, where certain large herbivores will seek out areas that have been burned after different amounts of times because there's plants that grow there in larger abundance than they would normally grow. So there might be an aspect of that happening with this animal as well, which is pretty cool. Again, it's a sample size of 1. We don't really know. We don't have a lot to compare to, but it's a cool idea. The other thing that we were able to learn, which I thought was the coolest part of the study, was we can actually put a bit of a seasonality aspect to this. So I mentioned that there's lots of fern leaves preserved, and we know what type of ferns they are and kind of the specifics of that because we have the sporangia preserved. So spores, if you take a fern leaf and you turn it over, you'll see all those red bumps. Those are called sori, and each of those is basically a mound where we have all these a sporangia, which is basically a sac that contains all the spores. And those spores can be diagnostic to different types of ferns. That's how we can learn about the diversity of the ferns in the gut. But if we look at those sporangia, they're preserved intact. They're beautifully preserved, and we know they haven't opened up yet, but the spores are ready to go. So we know that they're mature, they're ready to release things, but they haven't released yet. We can also look at the cross sections of some of the twigs that we're eating, and we can look at kind of the growth rings, and we can see that last growth ring is it hasn't reached that slow point where it slows down in the non-growing season. It's still in the rapidly growing season. We can also look at the relative abundance of like cycad pollen, for example, and when that tends to be released. And relying on our paleobotanists heavily, we were able to reconstruct what timing of the season or the year this last meal was consumed, and that also gives us what time of year the animal would have died and been buried, because we know that must have happened very quickly. So we can say it was probably late summer or late spring to midsummer when this animal would have actually eaten this meal and would have unfortunately died and been fossilized. So the fact that for something 110 million years old, we can say it happened at this kind of rough portion of the year, I think that's quite exciting.
An incredible mystery to unfold.
That's incredible. Oh my gosh. I was getting emotional watching you get emotional telling us about that, because that's the kind of stuff that I absolutely love about paleontology. And this specimen in particular, it just keeps giving us more surprises. And I'm sure that there's more that you guys are working on that you can't tell us about yet that's going to come out eventually.
There are, we've published 3 papers on the specimen so far. There's a couple more in the works. And of course, the specimen is available for other researchers as well. There's other people that want to come and look at the specimen, both in a comparative context to compare it to what they have and to learn more about this animal as well.
So there's more surprises on the horizon for Borealopelta. That's incredible.
Always love it. Now, I know that the museum is not currently open to the public, but once things become safe and able to go out and visit, where can people come and see this gorgeous Borealopelta?
So the specimen is on display in our public gallery. It's in the Grounds for Discovery Gallery, which is the gallery dedicated to industrial finds. So you kind of go through and you pass the preparation window where you see all the technicians working, turn the corner, and there it is in its giant case. That being said, yes, the museum is currently closed due to COVID restrictions. When things open up, there will likely be timed ticketing for entry. So if you want to see the specimen or any aspect of the museum when things open up again, make sure you phone ahead or book online, because you have to have a time ticket so we can control the entry. But the specimen is on display to the public. It's interesting, when it first came out, I spent a couple of afternoons in there. There's a nice bench right beside the specimen, but far enough where you can kind of sit and just people watch, and you can see people's reaction to the specimen. And a lot of people have a really emotional reaction. They I don't know if it's because they thought they'd never see kind of a fleshed out dinosaur face to face, and now they are. I think that's a lot of it. That's certainly what I think is visually appealing about the specimen. But they have all sorts of reactions, and I like the ones where they get emotional.
Yeah. The Tyrrell Museum is a museum that I grew up in. I've been to probably 30, 40 times in my life, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, I'd absolutely recommend anybody to put it on their bucket list, because not only Borealopelta, there's other really great specimens on display. There's Black Beauty, there's a really great marine exhibit, the plesiosaur that they found in the mine, and there's also a mosasaur that has a bite mark on its face, which is pretty cool. So lots of really amazing things to see at the Tyrrell Museum.
It's on my bucket list. I'm going to get up there as soon as I'm possibly able to. I haven't had a chance to see it, but I've lived vicariously through Kat talking about this place. She loves it so much, and it's like I'm there. Caleb, is there any way that people could connect with you? And if anyone wants to reach out to see more of your work, how can they find you?
The best way to get in contact or to learn about research nowadays is actually things like Google Scholar. A growing number of scientific publications, especially in dinosaur paleontology, because it has a strong public interest. Mm-hmm. People are making the effort to make these papers accessible to the public and making them open access. So most of the stuff I've published in the last several years is open access. Anybody can download the papers for free and read them. So I think that's a big way forward as well. So, if you guys do visit, or the next time you visit the museum, let us know. And I don't know if you guys have ever been behind the scenes, but if not, we can probably arrange a behind the scenes tour. Again, we'll see what happens with COVID, because you only see a small chunk of the museum. We get a huge collection or a huge prep lab. So,
oh my God.
I don't know. Kat, you think we could swing that? You think we can make that happen? I got a thing. I'd have to push it. But
if the museum was open tomorrow, I would get on a plane.
I'm in Florida. I'll be there in an hour.
That is something I've always wanted to do. So I would be honored to see it.
Give us a heads up when you're visiting, and we can see what we can do.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a real honor for me and Jimmy. We were very stoked to hear that you were willing to come and talk to us today. And I've learned a lot. I'm sure Jimmy's learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody watching has learned a little bit more about Borealopelta and Nodosaurs than they did before watching.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on and allowing me to share my research and to kind of share about this amazing specimen.
Good times, huh?
That was
Wasn't
amazing. That was probably a highlight of my life.
This was very much your episode. And I want you to know that I freaking love it. So this has gone really, really well, and I'm super pumped.
And he said that we could come and visit collection.
I know.
They don't do that anymore, you know? And he said we could come and see the back. Yeah. Like
on a time-stamped visual record that that we know is him. We'll just show that. Hold on, watch. Just come on by. Let me know anytime.
I'm still losing my mind, so I'm really happy.
It's been an incredible interview, and this wonderful time we had to talk with Dr. Caleb Brown is proof just once again that it doesn't matter what you do, where you're from, or how old you are. Dinosaurs will always be awesome.